Hi. Before we look at how you can create your own RxJS operators, let's first take a look at what is an observable. So in RxJS, we have two main building blocks. We have observables and we have observers. Let's see how we can create our own versions of these. So for our observer, I'm going to create an interface called myObserver, which takes in a generic parameter of type t. And an observer allows us to listen for the three types of events. So we have next events, error events, and complete events. So for our next event, I'm going to add a handler function, which takes in a generic parameter of type t, and this is a void function. We have an error event, which takes in an error handler, which is a function that takes in an error parameter of type any, and is also a void function. And we have complete events, which take in a handler that doesn't take any parameters and also is a void function. For our observable, I'm going to create a class called myObservable, and I'm going to give it a method called subscribe. And that makes sense, because if you worked with RxJS before, you know that when we have an observable, which we can already instantiate with our myObservable of type number in our case, that's what we're going to use. Whenever we have that observable, we can subscribe to it. And whenever we subscribe, we usually pass in a handler for the types of events that we have. So we can have next, error, and complete events. So basically we're passing in an observer. So I'm going to make sure that our subscribe method takes in an observer of type myObserver. Now, let's pass in our observer here. So I'm going to copy this over. And whenever we get one of those events, so whenever we get a next event of type number, we're just going to log that event out. So I'm going to say log out the next event. We are going to log out the error event. And we are going to log out the complete event. Okay. Now, whenever we subscribe to an observable, the observable is going to start to execute some work. It's going to start producing values. And to do that, I'm going to give our observable the option to take in a producer function inside of the constructor. So I'm going to say that we have a producer function, and that producer function takes in an observer of myObserver of type t, and it's a void function. Now, whenever we subscribe to our observable, that producer function is going to start to produce values, and it's going to send that values to the observer that we pass to the subscribe block. So in our subscribe block, we are going to execute that producer function. But first we need to pass it to our instantiation of the observable. So I'm going to give this a function that takes an observer of type number in this case. And we are going to produce some values. So I could say observer.next, and I could next a number event. I could also say that after some time, so using setTimeout, I'm going to send the next event, which is going to be the number 2. We can do that after 20 milliseconds. And then we can also do the same thing. We can complete after 40 milliseconds. So the observable is completed. Now, we have that producer function that is going to produce values. We pass it to our observable instance. The only thing we need to do now is whenever we subscribe, we are going to execute that producer function. And as soon as I do this, you will see that everything gets executed. So now we have those values being logged out. We have those next events which are sent, which are logged out. And we also have our complete event, which you can see that happens. We can also, whenever we change this to an error event, we will see that the error handler is being called. So let's recap. We have an observable, and our observable is taking in a function. And that function is going to produce values. So every observable has a function or something that is going to produce some values. Our observable also exposes a subscribe method, which takes in an observer. An observer is something we can use to handle the three types of events. Now, whenever we subscribe, we are executing this producer function, which means that observables are lazy. This is only executed when we subscribe. So when we subscribe, this is executed, and this producer function, which we pass in during our initialization, is going to start to produce some values. And those values are being sent to the observer inside of our subscribe block. And this also explains why RxJS is a push-based paradigm. We are not pulling out values. We are subscribing to the observable and we're passing in an observer. And we're telling the observable, hey, whenever you produce a value, just give me that value through the observer. So push the values towards me. And this is the main idea behind observables. We have observers and we have observables. And here you can see how these interact with each other. In the next video, we'll go a little bit deeper onto what operators are and how they work inside of this observable ID that we already have.